All right, everybody. Thank you very much for joining our webinar today, our How to Do Research and Get Published webinar on how to write a systematic review. I'm looking forward to today's discussion. To get us started, I'd like to introduce you to our team. First, Lauren Bauman is a senior editorial specialist working primarily with social science titles at Sage. She's a former researcher, instructor, and graduate student at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where she earned her MA in political science. Next, Robert Tinkle is a publishing editor for Sage, managing a suite of journals in humanities and social sciences. Before Sage, he earned his PhD in English literature from Johns Hopkins University, where he also served as associate editor for the journal English Literary History and directed the JHU Writing Center. He has published original research in journals devoted to Renaissance literature, culture, and history, and has taught several college courses in English and compositional writing. Next, Dr. Charles Cornell is a professor of clinical orthopedic surgery at Weill Cornell and an attending orthopedic surgeon at Hospital for Special Surgery in New York City. He is the editor-in-chief of HSS Journal and has authored 131 journal articles. His expertise includes adult reconstruction, joint replacement, orthopedic trauma, and hip fractures. And last, my name is Sean Skarsbrick, a senior marketing manager on the author marketing team at Sage. My primary role is to provide support to authors and reviewers as they move through the publishing process, with a particular focus on supporting early career researchers. I am based out of New York. Before we get started, I want to quickly highlight Dr. Cornell's work. As we mentioned, the HSS Journal is his publication with Sage. So if you're interested in that, joining as a reviewer, or if you have a manuscript that might be ready, consider this if this is your subject area. Before we get started today, I would like to ask that you send us your questions. On your screen, you'll see a Q&A box. Feel free to send any of your questions there. And we will start with those that have the most upvotes at the end of the call. And with that, I'd like to share a quick timeline of the typical author journey, moving from the very early stages of securing funding and conducting research all the way through peer review and publication. The webinar series that we work on covers a lot of these different areas, so we do encourage you to go back and watch recordings for anything that may be of interest. And with that, I'm happy to pass it off to Lauren.
Hi, everyone. So before we can get into the nitty-gritty, into the details of systematic review, we first want to make sure that we're all on the same page and define what it actually is. So a systematic review is a research synthesis that aims to comprehensively assess the existing evidence on a specific topic, right? Whatever your topic of interest is, that's within your research area. Systematic reviews are essential because they provide a rigorous and transparent methodology to gather, evaluate, and synthesize the best available evidence on a specific research question. Unlike other types of reviews, such as narrative reviews or traditional literature reviews, systematic reviews adhere to a strict protocol, which I'll go into detail with, that minimize biases and increase the reliability of findings. This systematic approach ensures that all relevant studies are identified, appraised, and included, which is crucial to making informed decisions based on the most comprehensive evidence available. The importance of systematic reviews lies in their ability to synthesize disparate data from multiple studies to provide a clearer, more nuanced understanding of the topic at hand. They systematically aggregate and analyze findings, identify patterns, and draw conclusions that are more generalizable and applicable to practice. This is particularly valuable in fields like healthcare, public policy, and education, where decisions can have significant implications, for patient care, public health, and resource allocations. By synthesizing the best available evidence, systematic reviews help bridge the gap between research and practice, ensuring that interventions and recommendations are based on the best possible data. So in the next slide, we'll talk about how are they different from other types of reviews. I already made a reference to how they are specific, but I'll go into a bit more detail. So systematic reviews stand apart from other types of literature reviews due to their structured and methodological approach. They are designed to address a specific research question by systematically identifying, appraising, and synthesizing all relevant studies. This ensures that the review process is comprehensive, transparent, and reproducible. One of the key methodological differences is the use of predefined protocols in systematic reviews. These protocols outline every step of the review process from defining the research question to inclusion criteria to detailing the search strategy and data extraction methods. Other types of reviews, such as narrative reviews, often lack such predefined methods, making them more prone to bias and subjectivity. That doesn't mean that these other types of reviews aren't beneficial, but they serve a different kind of purpose. So the objectives often differ significantly in these different types of reviews. Systematic reviews aim to provide the most reliable synthesis of evidence to inform decision making, whether in clinical practice, policy, or other fields. In contrast, narrative reviews often aim to provide provide an overview of a topic without systematically evaluating the quality or comprehensiveness of the evidence. In terms of the outcomes, systematic reviews produce highly rigorous and results that can be replicated, often accompanied by a meta-analysis to quantitative synthesized data. Narrative reviews, on the other hand, while useful for providing broad insights on expert opinions, lack the methodological rigor to support evidence-based decision-making quite confidently. And finally, for a last note on some of the differences, methodological rigor in systematic reviews is critical to ensuring that the conclusions drawn are valid and unbiased. By adhering to a strict and transparent process, systematic reviews reduce the likelihood of selection bias, reporting bias, and other issues that can compromise the integrity of the findings. This rigor is essential to maintaining the credibility of the review and ensuring it provides the most reliable evidence to guide future research, policy, and practice. On the next slide here, I've already mentioned the importance of having a protocol, so I want to go into a bit more detail about why we're talking about this so much, the systematic review, because it really is an essential feature to make sure that this reliability that we're showing is one of the strengths of the systematic review maintains and comes to fruition. So why is it so essential? And a systematic review protocol serves as a detailed blueprint for the entire review process, ensuring that every step is carefully planned and documented before starting the review. This is crucial for multiple reasons. First and foremost, it is essential for maintaining transparency, so ensuring that the review is conducted openly and openly documented. Second, it supports consistency and reproducibility, allowing others to replicate the review's methods and results. And finally, it helps in maintaining methodological rigor, ensuring quality throughout the review process. There are several components to a protocol, which you'll want to cover and keep in mind, including research questions, eligibility criteria, search strategy, data extraction, analysis plan, and more, which I will cover in more detail on the next slide. So what are these key components? First, you have a research question, right? The research question, which is the foundation of the review, it must be clearly defined, specific, and framed using frameworks like PICO, which stands for population, intervention, comparator, and outcome to ensure clarity and focus, right? So anytime you're doing anything related to research, you need to have a clear and defined research question. Next, you want to identify your eligibility criteria, which specifies which studies will be included or excluded based on factors such as population, intervention, outcomes, studies design, and publication date. The step is essential to ensure relevance and manageability of your review, right? You probably can't review every single article written throughout the entirety of time. You might need to specify, right, what are the date range that makes the most sense with the kind of studies that you want to pull for your systematic review. So be clear and explicit about what those criteria are that you're defining for your systematic review. Next, you'll need to make sure you have a search strategy, which is a detailed plan outlining where and how studies will be searched, including databases, keywords, and search filters. A robust search strategy ensures comprehensive coverage of the relevant literature. This is so essential to have this is called a systematic review. So making sure that you are being truly systematic and finding every relevant study to include in your review is incredibly important. So spend a lot of time thinking about your search strategy, right? Don't just go to one database, go to as many as possible to make sure you can find all the relevant studies as outlined through your eligibility criteria. Then you'll need to similarly have a data extraction plan. The data extraction plan defines how your data will be systematically collected and from the included studies, detailing the variables of interest and the format of documentation. This minimizes errors and ensures consistency. You also want to include an analysis plan, which explains how the data will be synthesized, whether qualitatively or quantitatively, like through a meta-analysis, and specifies the methods to assess study quality and heterogeneity. Finally, you want to be sure to consider risk and bias assessments, which includes tools of criteria for evaluating the quality and reliability of the included studies, which is critical for when you're interpreting to results. So to kind of recap, thinking about the protocol and why it's essential, right? This protocol really is your roadmap to ensuring the review process remains focused and systematic. It's essential for preventing deviations or changes in methodology that could introduce biases. So take time and care when developing your protocols for systematic reviews. Something that you might want to consider is pre-registration of your protocol. By pre-registering your protocol, typically on platforms like Prospero, researchers enhance transparency of the review, allowing others to see what was planned and compare it to what they've done. As noted previously, a detailed protocol helps to promote reproducibility, allowing other researchers to replicate the review process and validate the findings. This is key to credibility and reliability of your systematic review. And finally, having a clear and detailed protocol helps to manage time and resources efficiently by minimizing uncertainty and reducing the risk of overlooking important steps of a study. It's a critical tool for putting together a quality systematic review.
All right, thank you, Lauren. So I'm going to take over from here, and we're going to talk in a little bit more detail now about how to actually conduct your search strategy as well as the screening process. So really, this is about kind of gathering that corpus of academic literature that is relevant to your research question. And the search strategy is really the cornerstone of your systematic review, since it ensures that the review is really capturing all relevant studies. So a lot of you are probably already familiar with the really large, some of the really large databases like PubMed, the Cochrane Library, Embase, Scopus. There are even more, but these are some of the really big ones. So you're going to want to take advantage of those databases. And we're going to talk a little bit more on this slide about sort of how to search effectively in those databases. I also want to just emphasize, and Lauren already covered this on a previous slide, but emphasize how important it is to develop that list of fairly specific criteria that are unique to your particular research question kind of at the outset to help determine which studies are going to be relevant and which are sort of more outside of the scope of your research question. So that criteria might include things like, what population are you looking at? What methodologies are being used? You might look at the publication dates, for example, if you want to, only include studies from the last 10 years, for example. Really making sure that you have that fairly specific list of criteria from the get-go will help you to conduct a more effective search. So you want to start by identifying those really kind of core key concepts in your research question, and then begin translating those into a set of keywords, synonyms for those keywords. Those of you who are in STEM fields might also consider medical subject headings or MESH terms. This is, for those of you that might not know, this is an index of keywords that is sort of maintained by the National Library of Medicine. So if you're looking in a database like PubMed, which is run by the NLM, these medical subject headings might be of particular value to you. So, pull up a Word document, piece of paper, whatever, draft a list of these keywords that are sort of relevant to your research question. You'll then want to use something called Boolean operators. These are typically conjunctions. The most common ones are and, or, and not, as you can see on the slide here. They're always written in all caps to sort of indicate that they are Boolean operators. And you can use these to sort of combine the search terms on your keywords list. So a word like and, it might seem a little counterintuitive at first because and is usually an additive word, but a word like and is actually going to narrow the scope of your search a little bit because you're asking the search engine to find, X term and Y term. Both have to be included. So if you're looking, for example, for, gene therapy and let's say cloning, the search engine is going to return results that of studies that sort of include both of those key terms. Whereas a term like or is going to expand the field of your search, right? Because you're looking for, let's say, gene therapy or cloning, which means that the search result is going to return studies on gene therapy, studies on cloning, studies on both. And so you're going to get a broader kind of, remit from that. And then, a word like not will help you kind of refine the study, right? X term, not Y term. That's useful, if you have sort of two concepts that are normally related to one another. But in your case, for your purposes, you might want to exclude one of those terms. You would use the word not to sort of help do that. So, in other words, these Boolean operators help you to really take those keywords you've drafted and refine your search and expand or contract as needed. Thirdly, this is, I think, an important point. You want to consider including what's called gray literature to help minimize bias and expand coverage. Gray literature is a little bit of a fuzzy term, but it basically denotes everything that has not been published by kind of a traditional commercial or academic publisher. So this might include things like conference papers or theses and dissertations or government documents or reports. So again, everything that's kind of, you want this to be, of course, literature that, meets standards of academic credibility. Of course, this is not like, someone's personal blog or something, but these are it's literature that is sort of, again, beyond kind of the scope of a traditional academic or commercial publisher. So consider including that gray literature to sort of bring in new voices and expand coverage. You'll want to then sort of test the strategy with a few initial searches to make sure that you're capturing all relevant articles. So the goal here is really to refine as necessary to balance, on the one hand, sensitivity, so making sure that you're capturing all studies that are relevant to your research question, and then on the other hand, specificity or avoiding irrelevant results. And then this is really important too. You're going to want to save your search results, including full citations and abstracts for further screening. That brings us then to the screening process, which is kind of part two of this. And so screening is going to ensure that the studies are meeting your predefined eligibility criteria that I mentioned at the top, which is critical for maintaining the validity and reliability of the review. So we've kind of broken this down into two parts. First, you're going to screen this whole list of studies. It's probably going to be a fairly long list. You're going to screen this list of studies you've come up with, looking at only the titles and abstracts. So even though you've searched for important keywords, it might seem at first like, oh, this study is relevant because it includes my keywords. Sometimes a quick screening of the title and abstract will reveal that, oh yeah, this study is on this topic, but it's not actually that relevant to my research question. And there's a lot that you can actually glean from just the title and the abstract alone. So that initial kind of screening you do of your list of sources, you're going to be looking at just titles and abstracts, excluding the ones that are kind of most clearly irrelevant, and retaining the ones that meet those criteria that you had set at the beginning. And then you're going to go through a second time and screen the full text. So assessing the full text of those remaining studies to confirm whether or not they are eligible. Screening the full text doesn't necessarily mean having to read every single word, but I would suggest that you do at least a generous skimming. Read the conclusions thoroughly, read the first several paragraphs thoroughly, read the kind of look at the data, make sure that you have a solid grasp on the kind of data that the article is using and sort of how it's interpreting that data, and really kind of do a more thorough screening of the source, the full text of the source to determine its eligibility. There are software tools like Covidence or Ryan, Rayyan, or even EndNote that can help manage and streamline the screening process. So it could be worth looking into those tools to help you out, also save some time. And you're going to want to double check your search results to ensure that no key studies are missed. So, of course, some of the challenges that arise out of all of this would be addressing issues like duplicate studies. Again, some of those software tools can actually help with that, can help kind of identify and remove those duplicate studies. Language barrier might be an issue, or inconsistent indexing in some of these databases. So what you're going to want to do to kind of mitigate that is to double check your search results again. And also, this is important, try to bring in multiple reviewers, as many reviewers as possible, to sort of screen studies independently in order to reduce the risk of bias and error. And you're going to want to sort of clearly document the reasons for excluding. If you cut certain articles out of your list, you're going to want to document the reasons for exclusion, which will enhance transparency and allow others to understand your decision-making process. And again, multiple reviewers can sort of help you achieve that more effectively. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. Then we're going to talk in a bit more detail about, now that you have this list of sources that meet your eligibility criteria, to how do you actually extract and interpret that data. So we have a few tips for you. The first would be to create a standardized data extraction form. So this is kind of your own unique template that will help ensure consistency in the data collected from each study. So you're going to want to include fields for all of those essential details like study design, population characteristics, interventions, outcomes, and key findings. Again, there are software tools like Excel, Covidence, or there's one called RevMan that can help streamline this process. You'll want to then pilot that test form. So before you sort of launch into your full-scale data extraction, you'll want to test out that form that you've made with a handful of studies to sort of make sure it's working as you sort of intended it to work and that you're identifying and resolving any ambiguities or potentially missing fields. And again, bring in multiple reviewers. So we recommend having at least two, if not more, if possible, to sort of independently extract data from each study. Again, this helps minimize errors and bias, and then any discrepancies that might result from having multiple reviewers can sort of be resolved through discussion or by bringing in, an additional reviewer to sort of arbitrate. Finally, you're going to want to really make sure you're documenting everything. So recording not just the data, but also any assumptions you made during data extraction. Transparency is really the name of the game with the systematic review. So you want to make sure that, another person is able to kind of reproduce what you've done. And so transparency is really kind of the key to enabling that. So you want to make sure you're documenting as much as possible, tracking study quality. There are appraisal tools that can help you do this as well. Next, we'll talk a little bit about data synthesis. So this is sort of combining or interpreting data to help answer that research question. We've kind of broken this down into three types of data synthesis: quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods. So quantitative synthesis, or this is also sort of known or as a meta-analysis. Meta-analysis is basically synthesizing qualitative data from multiple sources in order to achieve a more generalizable conclusion than you'd get from a single study. So you can perform a quantitative synthesis if the qualifier here would be if your studies are sufficiently homogeneous or sort of similarly structured in terms of their design, population, intervention, outcomes, to be able to compare them quantitatively, right? So you need studies that are, and this might not be everything in your list, but if there's kind of a subset of articles or studies that are sufficiently homogeneous, you can sort of perform quantitative synthesis on them. You'll use statistical methods to pool your results and calculate overall effect sizes. And it's always useful to sort of present results visually through something like a forest plot. That's sort of a particularly common way to present results that are quantitative for further clarity and impact. Next, you have qualitative synthesis. This is when your studies are more heterogeneous or unalike in their structure, too diverse for a meta-analysis. In that case, you might want to opt for a more qualitative or narrative synthesis. So this involves grouping studies by themes, outcomes, or other relevant categories, and then summarizing your findings descriptively. So this will involve sort of identifying patterns, trends, maybe gaps in the evidence, and you'll want to sort of narratively discuss how the study characteristics like methodologies or settings might have influenced your results. And then thirdly, mixed methods synthesis, as you might imagine, is sort of a mix of quantitative and qualitative approaches. So this might mean, performing a meta-analysis on quantitative data while also providing thematic analysis of qualitative findings. So again, kind of the big challenge here is dealing with heterogeneity. You're going to, again, probably have a very long list of studies. They're not all going to be alike. They're not all going to have the same aims, outcomes, et cetera. So the challenge is dealing with that heterogeneity and ensuring accurate data interpretation. So in order to really draw meaningful conclusions, what you'll want to do is be as transparent as you can about both the strengths and the limitations of your evidence base. Acknowledge any gaps, any inconsistencies, potential biases in the screening process. And you're always going to want to relate your findings back to that original research question and highlight how they address it and implications for practice, policy, further research, et cetera. Again, use visual summaries, evidence tables, to your advantage to help clearly communicate synthesized results and their relevance. And by focusing on systematic, transparent methods for data extraction and synthesis, you can help ensure that your systematic review provides robust and meaningful insights. Okay, and next slide. Okay, so this slide is kind of a review of what we've already talked about. We're going to go over some sort of the challenges of a systematic review and then sort of potential solutions to those challenges. So the first challenge we have here is, in addressing bias in your study selection and maintaining transparency. So, you might miss studies either due to, poor indexing in databases or just the phenomenon of publication bias, which is sort of this idea that, in publishing, only positive results tend to be published. Studies that, set out to find something and sort of don't find it are just sort of inherently less maybe exciting, right? And they tend not to get published. As often, but they are equally important, right, to the research process. So this, of course, is not your fault as an individual researcher, but it's something to be aware of as you sort of engage your search and your screening. That studies may be missed for these reasons. So it's just something to be aware of. The second challenge would be as we talked about, dealing with heterogeneous studies. There's going to be a lot of variability in study designs, interventions, outcomes, populations that will complicate that process of data synthesis. You might come up as relatedly against sort of incomplete or missing data. Studies may, lack sufficient detail to allow for accurate analysis. Fourth, I mean, this is all a very time-intensive process. Systematic reviews require fairly significant time and resources. So this can lead to, burnout or taking shortcuts if you don't sort of have a clear plan or program in place. And finally, conflicts or disagreements among reviewers may arise. Again, we encourage you to sort of have multiple reviewers. This is I think a net benefit to you, but there's also a challenge here in that, people have different judgment, right, as they're looking at kind of the same evidence. So this may lead to inconsistencies in sort of how to use and interpret that evidence. Fortunately, with challenges come solutions. So we do have, suggested solutions for how to mitigate some of these challenges. So in order to address bias and maintain transparency, we recommend a search strategy that's as comprehensive as possible. So again, use multiple databases, don't just use one. Include some of that gray literature if applicable to help reduce publication bias. You might also consider collaborating with a librarian or some sort of other information specialist to help ensure that your strategy is capturing all relevant studies. And again, making sure that you have really well predefined inclusion and exclusion criteria sort of from the outset, and that you've sort of trained every reviewer thoroughly on how to apply these criteria. Next, in order to address that problem of heterogeneity, you might use subgroup analyses or meta-regression to explore sources of variability in quantitative synthesis. And for qualitative synthesis, you'll want to clearly document and discuss the diversity of your findings. As far as dealing with missing or poor quality data or incomplete data, it might be worth contacting, and especially in the case of something like missing data, contacting the study authors if possible for additional information. You might also use imputation methods or sensitivity analyses to account for missing data while acknowledging limitations. In terms of time management, it's really a good idea to break the review process into manageable phases that each have clear timelines, and assign tasks effectively among all of your team members to help distribute the workload and avoid that problem of burnout. And then finally, in terms of disagreements or conflicts among reviewers, you're going to want to plan for collaboration and conflict resolution. Again, use those software tools like Covidence or Ryan to help streamline collaboration, and have protocols in place for how to resolve any potential disagreements that may arise. Bringing in, if you have two reviewers, bringing in a third reviewer to mediate can be a good way to do that. So at the end of the day, it's really important to maintain methodological rigor, transparency. Rigor is going to ensure the review's reliability and validity. You want to follow a well-defined protocol to help minimize bias and build trust in the findings. So rigor, comprehensiveness, transparency is really the name of the game here. And with that, I believe next slide. Okay, I think at this point we're handing it off to Dr. Cornell to sort of summarize, give us some sort of parting thoughts, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Robert and Lauren, for two very excellent presentations. Basically, with systematic reviews as an editor and as a reviewer, the important things to remember are that we have to hold very, very high standards for systematic reviews because they have great potential to define new approaches and to create policy. This is very important in clinical medicine because often there's controversies as approaches to treatment. Systematic reviews are often used to try and resolve those controversies. And systematic reviews can tremendously influence current practice and current guidelines. One of the major pieces of advice that I have for authors that are considering systematic reviews is try and keep it simple. You want to best systematic reviews in terms of topic, look at sort of binary questions, A versus B. When you start trying to assess too many variables in a systematic review, the power gets very difficult and the inclusiveness of the analyses are weakened. So it's very important to be very specific, very succinct, and you're trying to solve a specific controversy. The other issue is assessing the quality of the studies that go into your systematic review. How's my audio quality? Is it okay?
You're going in and out a little bit.
In terms of the quality of the studies, obviously, if we're looking at clinical studies, randomized controlled trials are probably the best trials to combine in systematic reviews. Level 4 studies the conclusiveness of them can be improved by putting them together in a systematic review. Oftentimes, authors will combine randomized controlled trials, level 1 evidence studies with level 4 evidence studies. And I think that's methodologically a problem. I would avoid trying to do that. I would always try and select the highest evidence studies that you can find. The third thing that I think Lauren and Robert emphasized is the labor intensiveness of doing a systematic review. One of the things that I often see that authors will sort of not take seriously the analysis of heterogeneity and the analysis of bias. So if you look at the Cochrane tool for assessing bias, that defines for you a very labor-intensive process because you have to go back through each one of the studies that you've selected and individually evaluate each of those studies for bias. Oftentimes, authors will just sort of gloss over this and not put enough time into it. And what ends up happening when you read the systematic review is it doesn't really make much sense. They'll say that there's a certain amount of heterogeneity, but then there wasn't much bias. To me, that means that the authors have not really been rigorous in their assessment of bias using the Cochrane tool. Heterogeneity is also a very complex issue because there are many things that can lead to heterogeneity in the data. Yesterday, I actually reviewed a systematic review that was a follow-up of a revision type of total hip replacement. And the authors, one of their outcomes was survival of the implant over time. And they included studies that had 6-month follow-up and 10-year follow-up. So that, to me, that right there is a source of tremendous heterogeneity and weakens the study. I think when you choose to do a systematic review, it has to be a current topic. I don't think there's much point in doing a systematic review when there isn't much controversy. I think if the outcome's already known, the systematic review is not going to really add anything to the literature. Another favorite of authors is to update systematic reviews. So, for instance, there may be a topic of a controversial topic of great interest where there was a systematic review 7 years ago, a systematic review 4 years ago, and now authors want to do another systematic review to update the data. They have to really give us a good reason to do that, and they have to really focus on the new literature that's come out since the last systematic review. If there really isn't much new literature, I don't really see the point in publishing a systematic review that goes back over and rehashes prior work. So I think in summary, the important things are the rigor. As an editor, I want to make sure that the authors have rigorously looked at studies, that there isn't a lot of heterogeneity. There's really no point in publishing disparate data and trying to make sense out of something that you can't make sense out of, and rigorous assessment of bias. Those are the most important factors. I think novelty is important, and again, keep it simple, focus on sort of binary questions. Those tend to make the best topics for systematic review. So I guess we can go on and try to questions. Is that it?
That's great. Thank you very much, Dr. Cornell. And thank you, Lauren and Robert, for your presentation. Just quickly, before we move into the presentation, flagging that I will send the slides to everybody within the next week or two. In addition, we'll send a certificate of attendance for all of you who are joining live. So keep your questions coming through in the Q&A. We will get to as many as we can right now. But to get us kickstarted, I've got the first question here. What are the differences between a systematic literature review and a narrative review?
I'm happy to take the first stab at this if you want, since I talked about this in the presentation. So hopefully this is a bit of a review. But when I think about narrative reviews, those are your more traditional reviews. So they'll often be a bit more broader in scope. Their purpose will be different. The key main difference between systematic reviews and narrative reviews or more traditional literature reviews are your methodology, right? There's a really specific protocol and systems that you should be following within a systematic review, right? That we've all talked about pretty detailed. So you really do need to think about your predefined protocols, your methodology, having a really clear research question. And Dr. Cornell gave some clues as well of how to think about what kind of research questions you should be thinking about for your systematic review. But that's really the most important difference. There are also going to be different objectives, which makes sense also in the different methodologies. So again, in systematic reviews, you aim to provide the most reliable synthesis of evidence to inform that decision making, whether clinical practice, public policy, things like that. In contrast, narrative reviews usually want to give a more general overview of a topic and are less concerned about having that full systematic evaluation and are less focused maybe on thinking about the quality of every individual article and again are not going to be as detailed or as specific in the research question. And I kind of already noted this, but in terms of outcomes, there also can be differences. Systematic reviews, again, really want to produce highly rigorous and results that can be reproducible, often accompanied with a meta-analysis as you're synthesizing your data. Narrative reviews, again, though, are more useful for providing broader insights into a topic or an area. So as you're thinking about your own research question, you will do that kind of literature review or narrative review to give context of understanding of what other scholars and researchers are thinking about, but being less interested and maybe being critical or critical of like the methodology and being as disciplined and the methodological approaches that you're taking in a systematic review. But that core difference really is in having that really specific methodology, which is why it's so labor intensive, but incredibly useful if you're being thoughtful about the research questions that you're posing within your systematic review.
Yeah, I would add to that, Lauren, that sort of narrative reviews have a more educational purpose to inform the readership about to summarize current knowledge. We in medicine, we use grand rounds to present topics and for an educational purpose. And narrative reviews are more summaries. and they have an educational point of view. Systematic reviews are to resolve controversy. So the systematic review has to be a lot more structured, as you've said, and there's no point in doing a systematic review that is not methodologically intact, because the conclusions can have very significant effect in terms of influencing policy and clinical care. So systematic reviews, very strict, trying to resolve a controversy. Narrative reviews are much more of an educational tool.
Yeah, I think Lauren and Dr. Cornell both covered that very well. I would just add just one small piece additionally, which is that part of the rigor, I guess, of the systematic review is that you're also sort of documenting the reasons why certain studies were included or excluded. You don't necessarily do that in a narrative review. That might be sort of, taking place in the back of your own mind as you're kind of, qualitatively, putting sources together. But in the systematic review, you really have to sort of justify, okay, why am I including these studies and not these studies? Which just kind of adds another dimension to the rigor, right, of putting together a systematic review. So the transparency of it, and the kind of you're aiming for reproducibility, right, which is another thing that you're not necessarily doing in a narrative review. So as part of that objective to have your systematic review be reproducible, you're having to be especially transparent about why you're making the decisions you're making, right? So that just adds another layer to the project.
So Sean asked the question of how many variables or how many questions should you have in a systematic review, and the fewer the better is my point of view. I think when you're trying to resolve controversy, you want to have a narrow question. I think if the question is binary, that's the best. Is treatment X versus treatment Y, and having very specific outcomes well defined, and limiting the number of outcome variables that you're looking at. So that would, for instance, if you had treatment for an infectious disease that's potentially a fatal disease, treatment A might be one drug, treatment B another drug, and the outcome would be survival. So again, systematic reviews need to be quite simple. I think the number of variables need to be limited. The variables should be quantitative as much as possible. And so the comparisons are fairly straightforward.
Great, thank you for that. I have another question here that asked, how many keywords should you identify for a search strategy? Do you have any thoughts on that?
This might sound a little wishy-washy, but I don't know if there is a magic number. I think it's just sort of however many keywords are appropriate to your research question. Try to have a good handful of them. And again, you're using those Boolean operators to kind of combine your keywords in different ways to expand or contract the scope of what those keywords are able to sort of generate back to you. So I mean, it really depends. It depends on your research question. It depends on kind of what studies are available. Aim for as many as you can in order to generate as many sources as you can. You don't want to just put in 2 keywords and call it a day. You want to have a good number of them, but there's not necessarily, as far as I understand, there's not necessarily like a magic number.
Yeah, my advice would be to start with more as you work on your search. Starting with a lot of keywords. See what you get, and then narrow it down to focus what you're actually trying to address. So start with more, and then focus it, narrow it down as you progress with your search. Again, focusing on trying to ask a very specific question and get a very specific answer.
Thank you. I have another question that may be slightly related, at least to the number. Some people are asking the number of databases to use. So for example, some people are saying they're using 2, like Scopus and Google Scholar, but sometimes people aren't satisfied that's not enough. Do you have any thoughts on this, or does this again vary, case by case?
It definitely varies case by case for sure. You want what the risk is that you don't want to miss important studies. Most important studies are going to be picked up by the major the major databases. So generally 2 to 3 databases will cover 90 plus% of the literature, and you'll have overlap in those databases. So I think, you know, the major databases are quite obvious. And I think usually 2 to 3 is probably going to give you a capture of over 95% of the literature. I don't know, Lauren, do you have any feeling about that?
No, I would agree. I mean, if you're worried, if you're not getting as many, use your intuition, right? If you're not getting as many results as maybe you're expecting from your databases, then go and use more, right? Like, I don't think it's going to hurt you to check more, but I would agree that most of the main ones, right, the big databases should cover most of the information, but use your intuition, right? If you're not getting the kind of results that you're expecting in the number of papers, right? I will presume that if you have a particular research question, you've probably done a bit of reading about it before, right? This probably isn't your first time thinking about that area, that research questions. You'll have maybe some expectations about how much has been written about it before. So if you're not getting the results that you're expecting, then go to more. I don't know if Robert has anything to add in terms of thinking about some of like the gray area articles and how to think about those in terms of like if those need additional databases. Not to put you on the spot, Robert, but
No, it's
something that
fine.
would be helpful.
Yeah. I mean, I would just echo everything that's already been said. It kind of just depends on your field too, right? Some databases sort of cater more to particular, academic subject areas and fields than others. So it really is case by case. It just depends what your research question is, what fields you're working in, and yeah, just bringing in as many as are relevant, right, to your particular goals.
Yeah, remember when we talk about systematic reviews, we talk about risk of bias, risk of
Mhm.
creating an unrealistic conclusion. And so when you talk about the gray literature, I think you're increasing your risk. If you're getting journals that have a lot of bias in them, if you're including case reports, things that don't really have a lot of validity, I think there's more risk with that. So I think it's important to be very strict in the criteria that you use.
That's really helpful. Thank you. All right, pivoting slightly, we've got another question here. It asks, when surveying literature, what is best practice for absorbing other scholars' existing literature reviews or systematic reviews into your own? Do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, if you're talking about previous reviewing literature that has been previously treated with systematic review, I think you have to go back and assess the systematic review. You have to come up with a good reason to do another one, and that could be because it wasn't a very high quality systematic review.
It looks like you muted yourself, Charles.
Sorry,
No worries.
I'm sorry. I think it's important if you're going back and assessing prior systematic reviews or prior reviews on a topic. It's important to be very judgmental about those prior reviews. Again, I don't think there's any reason to repeat them just for the purpose of repeating them, because you're going to probably review the same literature. But if you find that a systematic review was not done methodologically well, then that's a reason to go ahead.
Very helpful. Thank you. Okay, I've got another question here about searching. So search criteria, excuse me. After an initial criteria search, I found additional studies. What does this mean? Do I need to go back and update my search criteria again?
I think if you found additional studies, you should probably try and include them if they meet your inclusion criteria. That's why, as Lauren said, I mean, you have to take your time. It's very labor intensive. This is not something that goes easily. A lot of authors, I think, consider systematic reviews as an easy way to get a publication. It's quite the opposite. Systematic reviews, we expect them to be extremely rigorous. So if you go back and you find, I mean, oftentimes good systematic reviews will go through all the literature, they'll go through all the reference lists, and if they find something in those reference lists that they didn't have, they'll add that to the study. So if you go back and you find studies that are pertinent to your question that you didn't include initially, you should add them.
Just to add quickly is be really thoughtful about adjusting your search criteria, right? You should be in the offset as you're thinking about your protocols, you're thinking about your searching plans. Like, be as diligent as possible. Don't expand things unless you think it's necessary. Because again, you're addressing a really specific research question. So totally agree with what Dr. Cornell said. If new things pop up that fit within your expected searching plan, right? Include those, right? It's important to be as comprehensive as possible, but stick unless you have a good reason to like change your expectations of your research question or what your criteria or parameters are, stick with those, or at least have a good reason why you're changing it, right? You need to be really methodical. You need to be really purposeful because that'll help you in your end results when putting together your systematic review. So you don't necessarily need to change your criteria, but if you find new things that fit within your criteria, again, assuming that you've thought really diligently about what your criteria is and why, then like stick to it unless you have a good reason to shift it and change, which there might be, but again, just be really thoughtful about that process.
Yeah, as Dr. Cornell said earlier too, I mean, you want to keep things simple, right? Simple in the sense of focused. So it's a little bit of a tightrope walk of, you want to be as comprehensive as you can be. You want to gather in as many studies as are relevant, but you do want to keep your research question as kind of tight and focused as you can, and really just include or exclude, the studies that either sort of belong or don't belong to that research question. So, if you're finding other studies sort of after the fact that are relevant, just be judicious about, sort of how relevant they are to your sort of major research question, and just make sure that you're maintaining that kind of tight focus and keeping things as kind of streamlined as you can.
Thank you all for that. So we're kind of talking about conducting the research and writing the review. But I have a really good question here about, I think, the step before that. Do you have any tips for how to identify gaps in literature? Any areas where you need to develop some sort of review?
Well, in the clinical medical fields, there's oftentimes controversy. So there might be two different types of surgical procedure used to treat the same disorder. There might be in orthopedics, we use a lot of implants. We use plates and screws. We use different types of hip implants or knee implants. And there can be lots of different studies looking at different implants treating the same disorder. So that would be a topic in clinical medicine that we would want to potentially review with a systematic review to try and come to some consensus. I think if you're outside of clinical medicine or outside of science, there are more sort of generalized controversies. Those are also, I mean, what those controversies are if you're planning to do a review. Again, it boils down to your research question based on prior literature. How did you come up with your question, and what are the controversies that you're trying to address?
That's really useful. Thank you. I think we've got time for one last question, and it goes back to gray literature, which, Robert, I know you were talking about earlier. And we've talked about across the webinar today. How do you justify including gray literature after you've attempted to systematically include studies that have validity and relevance from a database like Web of Science or Scopus?
I think there was someone who added something into the chat about gray literature probably having more relevance to fields that have softer data. I think in clinical medicine, we would refrain from including gray literature. We want to only look at peer-reviewed, accepted material in trying to address clinical questions. I think in the more less quantitative fields, I think gray literature may have more relevance, or in fields that are very rapidly developing. So, for instance, during the AIDS epidemic, research was going very, very, very rapidly, and new results were being found all the time, and there wasn't time to get that stuff published. So if you're in a field that's very rapidly developing, gray literature may have more of a relevance. But in clinical medicine, generally, I would say I would shy away from it.
Yeah, I would say, there's no requirement to include gray literature. It's a good idea, especially, again, just to kind of get that comprehensiveness in your review. If it's relevant to your research question, if it's relevant to your field of study, definitely consider looking for gray literature. The key here is transparency. So you really want to sort of clearly outline why that literature is important for your specific review, of course, without compromising quality, but to kind of get that comprehensiveness and just to make sure that you're casting as wide a net as you can to find those relevant studies. So, there may be a really great study that's sort of hiding out in the gray literature that you'll miss if you're not looking for that, if you're not including that in your kind of your wider remit.
Yeah, if you think about like if you do stuff that's maybe more public policy like oriented, there might be like NGOs or think tanks that might have relevant things. Again, you want to take everything with a grain of salt, see if they, you can assess for yourself whether or not you think that their methods are robust enough to be included, but it's just something to, as you're casting out your net, to consider. So again, it really depends on your field. It depends on your question, whether or not it might be relevant. But if you're dealing with like a really hot topic within some public policy area that you think relevant think tanks or NGOs that you think are reputable might have policy reports on, worth at least taking a look at them. Doesn't mean you need to include them as part of it, but could be part of your process as you're going to be reading a bunch of papers. And I don't think we've probably mentioned, I don't know if we've mentioned this thus far, but you probably will be reading many more papers, or at least looking at many more papers than you'll fully include again, right? As you go through that process of narrowing your research criteria, testing out keywords, right? Robert talked about, you can read the abstracts and titles, they'll help you, but you probably will be skimming things that you won't end up fully including because again, you want to be really thoughtful and methodical about what your specific question is and what should and shouldn't be included. So it's worth casting out your net to see if those other things might be helpful, but don't feel compelled to include gray literature.
Great. Thank you, Lauren. And thank you, Dr. Cornell and Robert, for your very keen insights. We are at the end of our call today. So quickly, I would like to just share what's upcoming from us. So we have a webinar happening on April 16th about doing the Digital Humanities Research Project. That is not part of our series, but is a sister series for us. In addition, join us for any of the upcoming webinars. We've got one on psychology, data collection and analysis, converting your thesis or dissertation into a manuscript, and then also one specifically for people who focus on business and management studies. With that, I would like to thank you all for joining us today, and of course, a huge thank you to our panelists, and I hope to see everybody in a future call. Thank you and take care.
Thank you.